Right, I think we are good to go. Hello and welcome to everyone logging in from different time zones to the 10th ThinkFest panel in our ongoing online series. My name is Ejaz Haider, and I'm going to be in conversation with Professor John Mearsheimer, who is our Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. To be very honest, I've been looking forward to this session since last August. This is when Dr. Yaqub Bangay said that we should try and invite Professor Mearsheimer to ThinkFest. And I remember saying to Yaqub, if you can pull that off, it's going to be a coup. So thank you, Yaqub, for making it happen. And thank you, Professor Mearsheimer, for accepting our invitation. Let me begin with a brief introduction to your work, and then we get to our topic of discussion. So political scientists, IR students and scholars, historians and sociologists around the world know Professor Mearsheimer and his work. He is what I would call one of the doyens of structural realist school. Interestingly, my first introduction, and I was telling this to Professor Mearsheimer before we got online, that my first introduction to his work was back in 88 or 89, when my late father, who was an infantry officer, recommended his book, Conventional Deterrence to me. That book, which was Professor Mearsheimer's first, is in some ways a different work from his later books. More a solid, hardcore military strategy and tactics book. Professor Mearsheimer wrote one on the British military theoretician, Little Heart, which for some reason, and again I was telling him this, is the only book I haven't read. His classic, of course, is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which explains his structural realist approach. His most controversial book, I might mention, which made the New York Times bestseller list and has, I'm told, been translated into 24 languages, is The Israel Lobby in US Foreign Policy. And he co-authored it with Professor Stephen Walt, who's another top-notch realist. The book's main argument that unwavering US support for Israel is not in the United States' interest is something I would say even Professor Chomsky couldn't have bettered. So Professor Mearsheimer's latest work is a 2018 book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities, which I would have called a sequel to The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, except it describes the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and realism, and which Professor Mearsheimer says is the trichotomy that provides an ideal template for explaining the failures of US foreign policy since 1989, and especially since 2001. But let's get to our topic of discussion this evening at my end and morning at Professor Mearsheimer's end. And the topic is why a Cold War between China and the United States inevitable. Professor Mearsheimer, here's what I propose. You make an opening statement of 10 to 12 minutes with reference to the topic. We can then talk about some specifics. We have about 60 or 70 minutes, and we'd like to keep at least 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here. I just wish I was physically in Pakistan instead of doing this interview virtually. But maybe someday, if COVID ever goes away, I can actually come to Pakistan and give various talks around the country. My basic argument is that a Cold War between China and the United States is inevitable. And when I say a Cold War, what I mean is that there will be an intense security competition between the two sides that will definitely have crises, but it's hard to say for sure whether there will actually be a shooting war. But that danger will always be present. And that was basically the situation that we had during the first Cold War. And again, my argument is that we're destined to be in a similar situation moving forward. Now, the question is, why do I think that's the case? You, Ejaz, identified me as a structural realist. And basically what that means is that I believe the structure of the international system forces states to compete with each other. And in this particular case, what's going to happen is that China is going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, why is this the case? The fact is that in the international system, there's no higher authority that can protect states. As we like to say in academia, the international system is anarchic. That means there's no higher authority. There's no international body that can help you if you get into a trouble. And the problem is that in the international system, there are oftentimes states that are very powerful and have malign intentions towards other states. So in a world where there is no higher authority, and there is a serious possibility that you'll have a rival that is more powerful than you and determined to hurt you, the best way to survive is to be the most powerful state in the system. To put it, excuse me, in slightly different terms, the best outcome is to be a regional hegemon, to dominate your region of the world. Because if you're really powerful, it's extremely unlikely that any other country will attack you. Think about the United States. No country in the Western Hemisphere would ever think about attacking the United States because the United States is so powerful. From a security point of view, you can't have a better situation. Let's talk about China. China was once very weak from the late 1840s until the late 1940s. They call this 100-year period the century of national humiliation. The Chinese understand that when you're weak, other great powers tend to take advantage of you. So the simple message that the Chinese take away from their history is that you want to be as powerful as possible. You want to be much more powerful than Japan, much more powerful than India, much more powerful than the United States. You want to be a regional hegemon. So what's happening here is that as China grows economically, it's translating that economic might into military might, and it is determined to dominate Asia. It is determined to become a regional hegemon. Now, the problem is that most of China's neighbors, not all of them, but most of China's neighbors find this situation unacceptable. It's certainly true with regard to India. It's true with regard to Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Australia, so forth and so on. Even more importantly, it's unacceptable to the United States. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. In other words, the United States believes that it should be the only regional hegemon in the world. And in the 20th century, the United States went to great lengths to prevent 4 countries from becoming regional hegemons: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. What I'm saying is that although China is going to try to dominate Asia and be a regional hegemon, and that makes perfect sense from China's point of view. I'm not criticizing the Chinese for 1 second. They should want to be a regional hegemon. But from the American perspective, that's unacceptable. And the Americans, therefore, will go to great lengths to prevent that from happening. And it will not only be the Americans, as I said, it will be a number of China's most powerful neighbors. So the end result of this is you're going to get an intense security competition. And of course, you can already see evidence of it in places like the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the line of actual control between India and China, and over Taiwan. I mean, the competition is already heating up, and it will become more intense over time. And it's driven, again, by the structure of the system. It's driven by the fact that states have a powerful incentive to be hegemons in their region of the world, because in a system where there's no higher authority that can help you if you get into trouble, there is no substitute for being really powerful. And if you're not powerful and you're weak, you're liable to fall victim to the century of national humiliation. So in a nutshell, Ejaz, that's my basic story.
Right. That's a great exposition. In fact, just to corroborate what you're saying with reference to the century of humiliation, over the last year and a half, I do a program which basically deals with regional security and interstate relations. And every time I have got Chinese experts on my program, and I'm talking about different people from different walks of life, one thing that has struck me, and that's like a motif that runs through everything that China does, uh, is about that century of humiliation and an insistence, if you will, that never again will China ever allow itself to be humiliated by any other state or any other people. So I think that's something that is very obvious in everything that the Chinese do. Now, just to recap, and I'm going to go back and forth in the sense that you talked about the crises. You've talked about the fact that there may or may not be a shooting war. Uh, since you referenced the first Cold War, now we saw lots of crises. That Cold War also gave us the term stability and stability paradox, where the center held but the periphery got destabilized. So, just quickly, what is your prognosis in terms of, are we uh, just moving into another Cold War with alliances? Uh, will the crises be in the periphery? And the reason I ask this is because right now there's a lot of conversation about South China Sea. So, how do you see this unfold? Are we again looking at stability and stability paradox?
Well, at this point in time, if you look at China, its major concern is building up military power in East Asia and settling three conflicts. One is the East China Sea, two is the South China Sea, and three is Taiwan. The other point of friction that the Chinese government is concerned with these days is the line of actual control with India. So those are the four scenarios that the Chinese worry about. And they're all directly in Asia. What's also going to happen, in my opinion, with the passage of time, is that the Chinese are going to build up significant power projection capability. The Chinese are building a blue water navy, and much like the United States, they hope to have the military capability to protect the Belt and Road all around the world. And as you know, many people define a superpower as a great power that can project its military might outside of its own region. So what I'm saying to you is that at the moment, the Chinese are concerned mainly on Asia and especially on East Asia. But as time goes by, they will be concerned about the periphery. Now, to take this a step further, I think the area they will be most concerned with is the Persian Gulf, because the Chinese get so much of their oil from the Persian Gulf. And in fact, they think about Pakistan as a way of, or a country that can help them secure their oil resources from the Persian Gulf. So Pakistanis know this issue very well. But what's going to happen over time is that the Chinese are going to build up significant power projection capability, and they're going to clash with the Americans in what you called the periphery, which would be areas like the Persian Gulf. So I think that's coming down the road. But in the immediate future, the main focus is the line of actual control and East Asia.
Right. Now, I also want to ask you about how, when you say they're going to dominate Asia, how do we define that domination? But I want to park that for a moment and move to something else, which I think is interesting in terms of essentially what I would call uh, application of theory. Now, in your latest book, and I asked this in relation to analyzing the practice of statecraft, you mentioned a field seminar on political theory, which you took with Professor Isaac Kramnik. And you said one important lesson or aspect was that theory is indispensable for understanding how the world works. Now, the reason I ask this is many people scoff at the idea of theory and argue that practitioners are not professors and theoretical formulations are ex post facto. In fact, interestingly, you make this point in the Tragedy of Great Power Politics also, where you talk about the virtues and limitations of realism. And since I'm sure we have students listening to this conversation, I would like you to explain the importance of theory and the dialectic between theory and practice. And then we can move on to certain other specifics back to the topic that we were discussing.
There's no question, excuse me, that many policymakers or people outside of academia think that theory is unimportant to them and that theory is something that academics do. Nothing could be further from the truth. All policymakers use theories to make sense of the world and to formulate their policies. Theory is God. Now, why am I saying this? The fact is that the world that we all confront is incredibly complicated. And there's only one way you can make sense of that world, and that is by coming up with simple theories that isolate the key factors that define that world, and then explain how those factors fit together to further explain the world and to allow you to formulate policies. There's no way you can maneuver your way through life, whether you're making economic policy, domestic policy, or foreign policy, without theories. And to tell you a quick story in this regard, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics won a book award from Georgetown University.
Yes.
And I went to receive the award, and at dinner, I sat next to Madeleine Albright, who had been Secretary of State in the Clinton administration.
Yes.
And people were talking about the tragedy of great power politics. And she said to me, she said, this theory is nice for you academics, but for people in the policy world, for somebody like me when I was Secretary of State, theories are largely irrelevant. It's just nice academic chit chat. And I said to her, I find this hard to believe because when I teach, I use you as one of the prime examples of a policymaker who used theory in her policymaking role. You could see the smoke coming out of her ears. She didn't know what I was talking about. So she said, what do you mean? So I said to her, your views and your policy prescriptions when you were Secretary of State were based on the three major liberal theories of international politics: democratic peace theory, economic interdependence theory, and liberal institutionalism. And I said, if you comb through your speeches and your written testimony before Congress, you are explicitly making arguments about how the world works and what American foreign policy should be based on theories. And I said, you're not an anomaly in that regard. Everybody thinks about foreign policy in terms of theory. Theory is not something that is restricted to academia. So that
what did she say to that? What did she say to that?
I think, to be honest, she was very curious. And I think she ultimately understood that I was correct, but she didn't admit it. She just took it in, so to speak. You could see her, the wheels were spinning. She was listening. And of course, I was right, number one. And number two, I was not making fun of her. I was actually saying that I use her in my classes as an example of somebody who employs the key liberal theories. So I think she had no reason to sort of come back at me and argue with me. So she was just thinking about it. And it would be curious to know what she thinks today about that issue.
Right. Okay. That issue of the definition of domination is still parked, but I want to talk about some of the specifics of US-China relations. Now, we have seen how former US President Donald Trump dealt with China. In fact, in Great Delusion, you wrote, there is good reason to think that with the rise of China and the resurrection of Russian power, having put great power politics back on the table, Trump eventually will have no choice but to move towards a grand strategy based on realism, even if doing so meets with considerable resistance at home. Now, do you think that he took a realist approach? Also, when President Biden talks about partnering with US allies to counter China, is it the same approach dressed differently, or do you see differences there?
I think that up until Donald Trump moved into the White House, the United States pursued a fundamentally liberal policy towards China. And the United States foolishly, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, the United States under Republican and Democratic administrations foolishly helped China grow into a potential peer competitor. When Trump moved into the White House, Trump recognized that China was a potential threat, and he pursued a realist policy toward China. Trump was interested not simply in containing China, but rolling back Chinese power. It's very important to understand this. Trump was not employing a simple policy of containment. He wanted to slow down Chinese economic growth and reverse it. Trump wanted to wreck Huawei if he could. He was a ruthless realist. Trump's great liability was that he was a unilateralist, and he was either unwilling or incapable or both of working with allies. And there's no way that the United States can contain China without using allies. It's just absolutely essential. Now, Joe Biden has replaced Donald Trump. And the big question in the United States today is, what will Biden do vis-a-vis China? Will he be nice to the Chinese and emphasize cooperation instead of competition? Will he, reverse Trump's fundamental policies towards China? And how will Biden interact with allies? My view is that Biden will be as tough on the Chinese as Trump was. Again, I'm a structuralist, and I believe structural factors are the driving force in international politics. And whether I'm president of the United States, you're president of the United States, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, so forth and so on, doesn't matter very much. Structure dictates that the United States has to have a forceful containment policy, at least toward China. The great advantage of Biden over Trump is that Biden is a multilateralist. Biden will be able to work with our allies and put together a balancing coalition, hopefully an effective balancing coalition that can contain China. So I think from a Chinese point of view, the coming of Biden is bad news, in large part because Biden will be more effective at crafting an effective containment policy than Trump was. I think Trump's basic instinct, again, that China had to be contained was correct, but Trump went about it in a ham-fisted way. He was basically incompetent in terms of executing the policy that we needed to deal with China.
Right. So it wasn't about direction. It was more about the execution of policy and the fact that, as you mentioned, that he is a unilateralist and he actually lost allies. But here's the thing, Professor Mearsheimer. You have also talked about, the structural realism is the overall umbrella, approach, framework. But there are times when you need finer grained theories to underpin, the structural realist approach. Now, you say that Biden would be equally tough, if not tougher, on China. But there are also areas where, for instance, climate change, for instance, pandemics, because these are issues that are transnational, transboundary. So it need cooperation of everyone, especially the greater powers, in putting together some kind of agenda to deal with these things. Now, do you think that that kind of cooperation is likely to uh, somehow ameliorate the other factors that go into peer competition?
I think just to start, uh, you can have a fundamentally competitive relationship where there are uh, arenas where cooperation is possible. Let's go back to the Cold War, the US Soviet competition. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were opposed to nuclear proliferation. So they helped create first the IAEA, then they created the NPT, then they created the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And in some ways, the Soviet Union was more committed to fighting proliferation, nuclear proliferation, than the Americans were. But the Americans were deeply committed. So, what I'm saying to you is, even though you had this intense security competition between the United States and China, excuse me, the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold
Soviet
War,
Union.
you also had opportunities for cooperation. And in the realm of nuclear proliferation, it was quite significant cooperation. Now, to go to your scenario, I think there's no question that moving forward, you are going to have significant and intense security competition. But at the same time, I believe there will be cooperation on a number of issues. One is pandemics, the whole subject of health. And number two is climate change. So I think there'll be cooperation. I do not think it will ameliorate the security competition in any meaningful way. My third point would be the, excuse me, the other area where you're going to get cooperation is actually at the economic level. There is a tremendous amount of economic intercourse between the United States and China, and between China and its neighbors. Some of that is going to end. There are going to be some changes, but a lot of it is going to continue. So you're going to have economic cooperation of all sorts. At the same time, you have an intense security competition. And people should think about the period before World War I in this regard. The Cold War is not a good analogy because, as you and I both know, during the Cold War, there was hardly any economic intercourse between East and West. It was all security competition, no economic cooperation. But before World War I, you had an intense security competition in Europe between the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. But at the same time, you had significant economic cooperation in Europe between all of the rival great powers. And I think that historical case is the good one, or the appropriate one, for thinking about the direction we're headed in terms of US-China relations.
Right. I'm so happy that you talked about it because uh, I've argued this a number of times that this whole trade for peace theory doesn't really, empirically cannot be justified. But having said that, let me still play the non-realist, and I say this with a silent chuckle, frankly, and go back to what we had parked in terms of how do we define domination. Now, China is also at the center of this regional comprehensive economic partnership. And this is a 15-member bloc, as you know, as accounts for about 30% of the world's population, about 30% of global GDP, which is nearly $27 trillion as of 2020. And since the US decided to walk out of TPP, RCEP is now the biggest trade bloc in history. So that's essentially a cooperative framework. And I also say this that every time I talk to the Chinese, they always ask me, why would we want conflict? They also refer to BRI, connectivity and trade, Beijing's buzzwords. So I just want to get you've already talked about and given the example of what happened pre World War One, but even so, in terms of just the sheer volumes of it, do you think that this domination or dominance that we talked about needs to be redefined in a different way, in a more cooperative framework, perhaps?
It just can't happen in my story, right?
Yeah,
I mean, basically, what's happening here is that China is growing economically by leaps and bounds. It's truly impressive to see Chinese economic growth in action.
absolutely.
And they're translating that economic might into military might. And Chinese will say to you or to me that they have no interest in conflict. They want to maintain the status quo. They're not warlike and so forth and so on. But look at what's going on in the South China Sea. Look at what's going on in the East China Sea. Look at what's going on with regard to Taiwan. Rightly or wrongly, the Chinese are interested in changing the status quo. And they've made it clear that they'll use military force to change the status quo. So the idea that China is this remarkably peaceful country and it's everybody else who's causing trouble is at odds with the facts. I'm not denying that the United States is a highly aggressive country. The United States is a highly aggressive great power. But I believe as China grows more powerful, it will become a highly aggressive great power. Domination is all about having supreme military might in your region of the world. Just think about the United States and the Western Hemisphere. No country in the Western Hemisphere would pick a fight with the United States because it is so powerful. That's point number one. Point number two is the United States has a Monroe Doctrine that says it does not want other great powers in its backyard. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Well, if you talk to the Chinese behind closed doors, they will tell you that they do not like the United States on their doorstep. They'd like to push the United States beyond the first island chain and then push the United States beyond the second island chain. I don't blame the Chinese one bit. If I were the national security advisor in Beijing, I'd want to push the Americans out of East Asia. I'd want to be much more powerful than Japan, much more powerful than India, much more powerful than Russia. I, again, want to be like the United States is in the Western Hemisphere. So this is not a status quo country. You know, I've gone to China over the years, and I make this argument to many Chinese people. I say, listen, starting in the early 1980s, you began to get integrated into this open international economy that the Americans and their allies created during the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, you got further integrated into this open international economy. You got integrated into the World Trade Organization, and you've grown by leaps and bounds. Why don't you just accept the fact that the United States runs the world, sit back and relax, and just continue to get rich the way you did in the 80s, the 90s, and the first part of the 2000s? Don't translate that economic might into military might. Rely on the United States to provide security in Asia and around the world, the way it did when you got really wealthy. I have never met a single Chinese who thinks that's a good idea. They do not want to let the Americans provide security in East Asia. They do not want to let the United States control the high seas around the world. They want to be a powerful country militarily. They want to provide security in Asia, not have the United States do it. And they want to have a navy that can protect their sea lines of communication from, say, the Persian Gulf to East Asia. They are a revisionist power at their core. And I fully understand that. And I have fully expected this since I first published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. It's just the way great powers operate. This has nothing to do with Chinese culture or Chinese ideology. It's all about structure. It's all about the way great powers operate in a system where there's no higher authority. There are just tremendous incentives in that system to be Godzilla and not to be Bambi.
Right. Now, this is a great point to segue to the tragedy of great power politics. Now, when I was reading that book many years ago, I found the use of the term tragedy somewhat intriguing. I'll tell you why. There are two reasons. One, obviously, as you know, you've written the book. The book's entire argument is about the inevitability of great power competition. And that's something you just talked about. Equally, tragedy implies something that shouldn't happen. That's because it's quite obviously tragic. I remember from the book where you quote Bismarck, should not want Poles to die, but he wants them to. It also gives one a sense that perhaps it being tragedy, it is avoidable. But if it's not, and if there is no higher morality at work in statecraft, why not just use inevitable? Why do I get the sense you don't like this inevitability and hence the term tragedy?
Well, tragedy is a word that's used in different ways. And I was using it in the ancient way, and I meant that it meant that great power competition, this intense security competition I'm describing, is inevitable. My basic argument is that states are locked in an iron cage. They can't get out. It's an argument that says that we don't have much agency, right? Structure is largely determinative. I would say to you that it's clear that in the United States and in Western Europe, and I think this is true more broadly around the world, that many well-educated people dislike my argument intensely. And I'm choosing my words carefully here. They dislike this argument intensely because it says in a very important way, we are doomed. There is no way out of this. You know, when I wrote Tragedy, and it was published in 2001, shortly thereafter, I started going to China. And I've been to China quite a few times. And I don't say this braggingly, but I'm something of a rock star in China. My book has been widely read, and whenever I go to speak at different universities and at think tanks and so forth and so on in China, there are always huge audiences there, and people love to engage with the argument. But anyway, in the beginning, the reason that so many Chinese were interested in my argument is they understood, number one, the power of it. You know, there's a certain power to the argument that I think is undeniable. But what they were interested in doing was trying to figure out, by listening to me, how they could avoid the tragedy of great power politics as China grew economically. So in other words, they knew when they listened to me talk that there was a real danger that China would translate its economic might into military might and end up in an intense security competition, in which case it could get into a lot of trouble. So the question then becomes, how do you avoid this? And basically the Chinese were saying that we believe we have agency. We believe we can figure out a clever way to avoid the tragedy of great power politics. And they would always ask me, what do I think about that? And my answer was always, you're wasting your time. You cannot avoid it, right? And by the way, a lot of Chinese, I would say to them that if you want to avoid the tragedy, just don't translate your economic might into military might and accept the fact that the United States runs the world. Then there'll be no tragedy of great power politics. The United States will have no problem with China, and you'll live happily ever after. But as I said to you before, I have never met a Chinese person who was willing to accept that outcome. Chinese scholars, Chinese public intellectuals, Chinese policymakers all want to dominate Asia for good strategic reasons.
Right. I'm happy you talked about that because, especially since 2015, China has embarked on a very ambitious military modernization program. Now, I wanted to ask you, during Deng Xiaoping's period, when China was growing, there was the sense of, keeping below the radar approach. Let's not flex our muscles. Under Xi Jinping, we see a China that seems to be saying, well, we have arrived. Now, is that something which has caught the US attention and will drive the US approach to China? Or, as you mentioned, this competition is something that just inheres in the structural realist approach, because you talked about this as being an iron cage.
Well, Deng Xiaoping understood that time was on China's side. And for China, the smart thing to do is to lie low, to not make a lot of noise, and just continue to grow and grow and grow. And ultimately, at some point in the distance, maybe 25 years down the road, you'll be so powerful that you can push the Americans around in East Asia in ways that you cannot today. So in other words, what I'm saying is it's in America's interest to draw the lines in the sand or to establish the rules of the road in the US-China relationship now, not later. Just take Taiwan, for example. China doesn't want to settle the Taiwan issue today. They're much better off waiting 25 years, 30 years, and settling it when China is much more powerful relative to the United States than it is today, okay? That's point one. Point two is, the question is whether or not that is Deng Xiaoping's policy is an effective policy. And the reason I say that is the United States really doesn't care that much about what China says. What the United States cares about is how much power China has. So as China grows more and more powerful, the United States gets more and more nervous. And you get, under Hillary Clinton in 2011, the pivot to Asia. Remember, before Donald Trump moves into the White House in January 2017, 6 years before, in 2011, Hillary Clinton, who's a liberal Democrat, had announced the pivot to Asia. So the United States early on was sensing that there's trouble in store, regardless of what China said, right? It was just that China was growing so powerful. So I think Deng Xiaoping was obviously a very, very smart man and a first-rate strategist. But there were real limits to how effective that strategy could be over the long term. And what's happened here is that the United States has begun in a serious way, starting with Trump, to try to contain, if not roll back, China. And a lot of what Xi Jinping and the Chinese do today is initiated by them, for sure. But a lot of what they do is in response to the United States. And if you talk to many Chinese policymakers and public intellectuals, they will tell you that they would have preferred to pursue Deng Xiaoping's policy. But it was impossible to do that because the United States was in their face, so to speak. The United States was moving to contain China simply because its material power was increasing at such an impressive rate.
That's a very incisive point. Now, we've got some questions also, but before we get to those, very quickly, Professor Mearsheimer, give me your sense of how you look at the project that Professor Graham Allison was running at Harvard, the whole idea of the securities trap and the desire to somehow escape it. But very quickly, so that we can move on to the questions that I've got now.
Well, I think the basic argument in the Thucydides trap is similar to the argument that I'm making, right? It's basically a structural argument. Allison doesn't have an explicit theory. It's not a theoretical book, but his basic argument is that structure causes states to compete with each other. And anytime you have a dominant state that's challenged, the challenger and the dominant state run the risk of getting into a war. So I don't see anything in the Thucydides trap that's, not covered by my argument or any other sort of structural argument about the US-China competition. I think what's nice about his book, it has a very clever title.
That's true. Okay, let me get to these questions. There is one, Humayun Javed, he's saying, what would an inevitable conflict, as you predict, between two great powers mean for global public goods and smaller countries of American and Chinese influence, where confrontation would play out as it did during the Cold War? And a second question, we'll just take two. So how does, he's asking you, how do you view multipolarity? Whether the world's really moving towards multipolarity or bipolar plus, in which both superpowers will hold sway with some sort of leverage available with other important players?
Yeah, let me take those in reverse order. I think that we live in a multipolar world. And this, of course, is why great power politics is back on the table. During the unipolar moment, there was only one great power. By definition, in a unipolar world, you can only have one great power, and you can't have great power politics because, again, there's only one great power. Starting in roughly 2016, I would say as Trump was coming into the White House, the world had, at that point, clearly moved from unipolarity to multipolarity. And this is why shortly after Trump became president, people in the Pentagon and people in the White House began to talk about the return of great power politics. Great power politics was back on the table because we now are in a multipolar world. It is important to emphasize, however, that in that multipolar world, that there are two great powers that matter more than the third. And China and the United States are the two most powerful of those three great powers. Russia is the weakest great power, and its power is likely to decline over time relative to American power and Chinese power. So for this reason, you find some people even arguing that we're in a bipolar world. It's the US-China competition, just like there was the US-Soviet competition between 1945 and 1989. I think that it's a multipolar world. I think the Russians are a great power, and we should pay serious attention to them. But there's no question that it's the US-China competition that's going to have enormous consequences. That brings me to the second issue. What are the consequences for smaller countries? It's very hard to generalize. This could be detrimental for some countries because the United States and China could end up fighting a proxy war. Remember, during the Cold War, the United States fought against the Soviet Union and China in a proxy war in Vietnam. So you could have proxy wars. Then there are countries like Pakistan. It's a very interesting question to ask where Pakistan ends up.
That's actually the third. That was actually the third question. But go ahead. That's a question about what should Pakistan do. What would be the status of Pakistan?
Yeah, I think in all likelihood that Pakistan will be allied with China. I think India will be allied with the United States. I think the United States will go to great lengths to peel Pakistan away from China and to have good relations with Pakistan and India, and have Pakistan and India together in a balancing coalition against China. I do not think that's going to happen. I think that the Pakistanis will be closely allied with the Chinese in this emerging Cold War. I think Pakistan can still have decent relations with the United States, but I think if forced to choose, the Pakistanis will choose the Chinese over the Americans. I think the Indians will clearly be allied with the Americans against the Chinese. I think the other country that bears some resemblance to Pakistan is Myanmar. I think the United States has been working very hard to get Myanmar on its side and not to have Myanmar allied with China. But I find it hard to imagine Myanmar not ending up allied with China. So there'll be all sorts of countries that in a way get caught in the middle of this competition. And just go to North Korea versus South Korea. As this Cold War heats up, the bonds between North Korea and China will tighten, and the bonds between the United States and South Korea will tighten. And then you got to ask yourself, what does this all mean for Central Asia? All the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth and so on. If you talk to the Russians will tell you in private that they're very nervous about Belt and Road in Central Asia. A lot of Americans tend to think that the Chinese and the Russians sort of see the world exactly the same, but that's not the case. And the Russians are very nervous about the Chinese, even though they have good relations with the Chinese these days. So how that plays out is very tricky. I've predicted, by the way, and we'll see whether I'm right, I've predicted that over time, the Russians will switch sides and the Russians will end up allied with the United States against China, because I think China is the greater threat. China is the greater threat to Russia than the United States is. But there are just all sorts of big questions floating around there that are hard to answer. With regard to global public goods, I don't know what to say. When I think in terms of global public goods, I think of climate change, I think of pandemics and so forth and so on. And as I said before, in response to Ejaz's question, I think the United States and the Chinese will cooperate there. And I think we'll be in decent shape on that front. But these are really, excellent questions, but tough questions to answer.
Absolutely. I'm happy you talked about Russia, because I was going to ask you about US-Russia relations and Russia-China relations. You partly already talked about, and I know I heard one of your talks in which you talked about Russia ultimately sort of switching sides. But with reference to US-Russia relations, now you have often argued that the American policy towards Ukraine, and again, motivated by liberal logic, is principally responsible for the ongoing crisis between Russia and the West. Now, does that mean you absolve Moscow of pursuing a policy of expanding its influence in its near abroad? And I ask this because it seems to me, purely going by the logic of structural realism, that Russia would do that. So Russian actions.
I didn't hear all of your question, but I think I understood exactly where you were going. So I'll take a stab at answering it. Look, the United States, I believe, is principally responsible for causing the present crisis with Russia. And it had to do with three policies that were all neatly tied together. One was NATO expansion, two was European Union or EU expansion, and three were the color revolutions. This is the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And those color revolutions were designed to spread democracy in Eastern Europe, and I believe ultimately in Russia itself. The Russians lived in fear of a color revolution in Russia, which would have meant toppling Putin from power. So anyway, what happened throughout the 90s and then into the early 2000s was that the United States and its European allies moved NATO eastward right up to Russia's doorstep. It moved the EU eastward right up to Russia's doorstep. And it was facilitating color revolutions on Russia's doorstep and even talking about a color revolution in Russia itself. This disturbed and scared the Russians no end. The Americans surely should have understood this. The Russians said after 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia were not going to become part of NATO. That simply wasn't going to happen, because you want to remember in April 2008, the United States forced NATO to declare that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The Russians went ballistic. This ultimately ended up in February 2014 in a major crisis. The Americans, of course, never blamed themselves for anything, and they always blamed somebody else. So the Americans blamed the Russians and Putin in particular, and he became the devil incarnate in American political discourse. That's story number one. Story number two is that Hillary Clinton was defeated by Donald Trump in 2016 in the presidential election. The Democrats could not accept the fact that Hillary had lost to Trump. How could this be possible in a fair election? So they decided that it was the Russians who interfered in the election and were responsible for putting Trump into the White House. So what happened vis-a-vis Ukraine, coupled with what happened in the 2016 presidential election, thoroughly poisoned U.S.-Russian relations. The level of Russophobia in the United States today is hard to believe. And there's no sign that it's going to improve under President Biden. This is not in America's interest. The United States has a vested interest in having good relations with Russia so that Russia will help balance against China, so that Russia will help the United States deal with the Iranian nuclear crisis, the North Korean nuclear crisis, and so forth and so on. But it does not appear that we're in a position where we meaning the Americans, are capable of switching gears and changing in fundamental ways our policy towards Russia. So I would expect in the first Biden administration more of the same.
Right. As a matter of fact, now that you mention it, when President Biden was the vice president, he was very active on the Ukrainian issue, and so I guess he's going to pursue that policy. But there's another question that I've got. Let me see. It says Henry Kissinger, in his book, praised the Indian diplomatic policy of neutrality during the Cold War with Soviet Union. Why do you think that India will deviate from it this time? Any war between China and India will benefit the US, and India would not allow that to happen because they are also on track to become a great power. Now, this is someone's question, although I'm not sure if I agree with the fact that India was entirely neutral during the Cold War, or that it is on track to become a great power. But what are your views on this?
Yeah, I won't address the question of whether it's on track to become a great power. If it's on track, it's a good distance off. India is not going to be a legitimate great power for quite a while, but it is a powerful state. There's no question about that. Look, the US-China competition has fundamentally different consequences for India America relations than the Cold War did. The Soviet Union was not a threat to India in any way. The United States was not a threat to India in any way. So it was possible for India to sort of remain neutral and to actually have good relations with the Soviet Union, much to the chagrin of the United States. And that was largely for geographical reasons. The present situation is fundamentally different. India and China have two major points of friction. The first, which was in the news in the summer of 2020, is the line of actual control. This is a huge swath of territory where the two sides cannot agree on where the line should be drawn. And as China grows more powerful, China is going to try and determine where the line is drawn. And it's going to use military force to do that, in my opinion. This is just the way great powers behave. The Chinese will try to settle this issue, just like they'll try to settle the South China Sea and East China Sea issues on their own terms. That's friction point number one. Friction point number two is that the Chinese are building a blue water navy that can project power into the Persian Gulf. That means they have to come through the Indian Ocean. This scares the living daylights out of the Indians. And by the way, if you read the Indian press, the Indians are very concerned that they're spending so much money on their army for purposes of dealing with the line of actual control and also dealing with Pakistan and the disputed boundary there, that they don't have enough money left over to spend on their navy. And they're ultimately going to run up against the Chinese Navy, which is projecting power in the Indian Ocean, which is an area obviously of great strategic importance to India. So India is in a fundamentally different situation vis-a-vis China and the United States than it was in the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the United States.
Right. I'm happy you talked about the geography, because in the Great Delusion, you talk about geographical spaces that become sacralized. And you give the example of Taiwan, over which you argue that China will go to war, even though it will do significant damage to China's economy. How does realism grapple with this calculation? Non-realists would perhaps consider this cost-benefit not rational. Hence my query about the calculus.
Well, a basic realist argument would focus on pieces of territory being important for largely strategic reasons. In other words, you could argue that from China's point of view, Taiwan is an important piece of real estate for strategic reasons, for projecting power beyond the first island chain and so forth and so on. But realism has no place in the theory for the argument that Taiwan is sacred territory and that China will, fight and die for Taiwan for nationalist reasons. So that is not part of the theory. Theories, as I said before, are simplifications of reality. And that part of the story is not in there, but it certainly matters. And my argument in The Great Delusion is that nationalism tends to reinforce realism, right? That they tend to be, I call them kissing cousins,
Yes.
Those two isms, realism and nationalism.
Yes.
But one does not want to underestimate how important Taiwan is to China, not necessarily for strategic reasons, but because of nationalist reasons. And this all goes back to the century of national humiliation. The Chinese lost Taiwan in 1895, and they lost it in a war with Japan. And two of the countries that the Chinese believe humiliated them greatly were Japan and the United States. And so Taiwan has a very special place in the heart of every Chinese person I have met in recent years.
we have one other question. How this decoupling will impact. Now, I'm not sure what he means by this decoupling, but anyway, how this decoupling will impact technological realm of both powers. Is there any possibility of emerging distant spheres of technology in space, telecommunications, etc.?
I think what the questioner is getting at is the fact that the United States under Trump was trying to decouple its economy as much as possible from the Chinese economy. I think there was a widespread feeling in the Trump administration that by integrating the American economy into the Chinese economy and vice versa, by having all this economic interdependence, the United States was economically helping China to grow. The United States was helping Huawei to reach the point where it could run Silicon Valley into the ground. It was this kind of argument. And the big question on the table is whether the United States can decouple its economy from China's economy in a meaningful way, and therefore hurt China's economy, hurt Chinese economic growth, and at the same time not hurt American economic growth. Trump was clearly trying to do this. I think the jury is out on whether it worked or will work in the future. I think there's no question that the United States in the future will try to maintain American technological supremacy, and it will see Chinese technology as a threat. And the United States will try to mitigate or dampen that threat. Whether it can do that, I don't know. I would not bet a lot of money that the United States will succeed. I would not bet a lot of money that when we look back at Trump's policies, his decoupling policies, that there's much evidence that they worked. But at this point in time, it's just too hard to tell. And I don't have the expertise to know. And I don't know anyone who I really trust who can tell a story that I think provides the approved answer to the question on the table. So all I can say is
Right. Right. Okay, I missed this one. If the Cold War were to get hot between the US and China, where do you think it will be? So the question is asking you to sort of identify the areas where this could actually get hot, because you talked about the proxy sort of, the periphery getting destabilized.
I think the most likely place is the South China Sea. And I think a naval incident or an air incident that escalates into a limited conflict is a real possibility. I think the East China Sea and Taiwan are possible scenarios to worry about for sure. But I think the East China Sea is the most likely.
Right. Now, obviously, there's much else we could have discussed, Professor Mearsheimer, but we've run out of time for this session. Hope the viewers enjoyed the professor's erudition, the ability to put across complex ideas simply. Incidentally, this reminds me, Professor Mearsheimer, of something you credited to the seminar you took with Professor Krasnick. The way academic writings are done. So let's not do it like that. Personally, it has been a pleasure to finally speak with someone whose works and ideas I've been reading since the late 80s. And frankly, you've done so much to influence my own thinking about interstate relations and statecraft. Thank you so much, Professor Mearsheimer, for being with us at ThinkFest and for enlightening us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you.